Because I think particularly, and you saw this morning where we're going to end, or where this passage ends with a widow giving 2 copper coins. And yet I think that story, along with the entire chapter, oftentimes isn't appreciated in its context. And so this morning I want us to really try to understand how the pieces fit together. Okay? So I'm going to try to bring this together because I think if we're really going to appreciate the story, this story is really not about financial giving. That's really not. Sometimes I've heard it used in that sense. That's really not what it's about. And so sometimes we distort the meaning. And so we're going to spend some time kind of reviewing the context of this and get the rest of the story. We may know some parts, but we'll bring it together. And so this chapter and this section is the concluding section of one of the greatest theological showdowns of all time. These stories, these interactions, they unit, and they come off the context of, in chapter 11, Jesus presenting Himself to Jerusalem as the King. Again, Mark only has Jesus visiting one time to Jerusalem. We know from the other gospel accounts He visited other times. But Mark has been holding this off until finally He comes to Jerusalem, the one who's proven Himself, the one who's demonstrated He has all power, all authority, all control over everything. And He's taught His disciples what it means to follow Him. He now comes and presents Himself. And He is rejected. Presents Himself. And He is rejected. He goes into the temple and He cleans house. We call it the cleansing of the temple, but in essence it was shutting it down. They were bankrupt. They had turned God's house robbers and thieves. And so He speaks a condemnation against the establishment. And then, following that, in the beginning of chapter 12, He tells the parable, an old familiar story with a contemporary twist. He reaches back to Isaiah and picks up the story of the vine. And it was a story that everyone knew. But suddenly He puts a twist on it. It's not about the vine. It's about the vine growers. And what will the Master do with those who were entrusted to care for the vine? It's a message of condemnation, and the leaders understood, it says in the text, that He was speaking about them. Gather in the temple complex and they begin this showdown. This is a gathering of the elite, of the leadership of the day, in a series of attempts to discredit Jesus. They are going to try to prove that at best He's a simpleton that doesn't know what He's talking about, and at worst that He's demon-possessed and working with Satan. And so they assemble some different groups. In our modern day, it would be the equivalent to our U.S. senators, our representatives, the President, Vice President, and Supreme Court in the Capitol firing one question after another. I guess things don't change that much, do they? This is a gathering of the elites, and they're firing questions at Him to try to trip Him up, to try to prove that He's someone that people shouldn't follow, shouldn't pay attention to, and He has no standing or authority. So the Pharisees were there, the Herodians, the scribes, and one after another they are bringing questions trying to prove that Jesus is incompetent. But in doing so, they further validate Jesus' words that they are the ones who are incompetent of their spiritual. that they are the ones who are incompetent of their spiritual leadership. The last couple interchanges have been with the scribes, and so this morning is specific denouncement of the scribes. And so I think we need to step back appreciation of who these people were. I've already mentioned some things about them, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper this morning because Jesus is going to specifically condemn them, denounce them, but they also form a huge contrast that's intended this morning. So since it's not part of our culture, who they were. At the time of Christ, they were the intellectual upper class of the day. As I mentioned last week, the scribes were a vocation. They were a profession. It doesn't have to do with their theological ideology. They could be scribes of the Pharisees, those who believed in all the books of the Old Testament, and those who followed the oral tradition. That's what distinguished the the Pharisees. Or they could be of the Sadducees who only focused on the Pharisees. Or they could be of the Sadducees who only focused on the first 5 books. But it was a vocation, not a theological position. However, most of the scribes were of the Pharisaic tradition. But it was a vocation. They were the official experts. They were the ones that defined what it meant to obey the law and to be morally pure. They were the experts. If you wanted to know and understand what it meant to be right, to live with God in a right way, you asked a scribe. Unlike a Jewish priest, they had to be from the tribe of Levi. The scribes weren't by birth. It's not the family that they came from. It was an academic pursuit. These were individuals not because they were born into it, but they chose a profession, a vocation. Now, oftentimes directed by their parents, but it was their knowledge, their training alone which gave them power. They'd been through rigorous training, which I'm going to explain a little bit more. They'd been through the rigorous training, which I'm going to explain a little bit more. They'd been through this academic training, this from a youth on up, and they had mastered this body of knowledge, and that gave them power. Anyone who wished to join wanted to be a scribe, if that was your academic pursuit, you had to pursue a rigorous study, a course of study. Many historical examples, I could cite many of them and I won't this morning, but show this course of training and talks about it in detail. But it would begin at a very early age as a young boy. It was a lifelong dedication. I think this may factor in John chapter 3. You remember when Nicodemus came to Jesus by night and Jesus said, "How is it you being the teacher of Israel, the number one? You're the teacher of Israel, the number one. You're the guy on the radio. You're the John MacArthur of the day. How can that be and you don't know this?" And then he says, "You've got to be born again." And they went back and forth. "So you mean I'm supposed to crawl up in my mother's womb?" Neither Jesus and Nicodemus weren't stupid, okay? They were talking in metaphors. What Nicodemus was saying, "Are you telling me I have to start all over?" Ain't going to happen. See, that's what he was saying. He didn't really think, really? I'm supposed to shrink my size and get up in my mother's womb? You're talking in metaphors. I've ascended to the pinnacle. I'm the top. I'm the number one. And you're telling me I got to start over? That's what he was saying. And so from a young boy, they would dedicate themselves to academic study. They would attach themselves to a master whom they would follow in daily life. So the master would teach them, but they would also follow them around. They would trail behind them. They would hang on every word the master said. They would observe his actions, how he interacted with people, even the gestures he would use. He interacted with people, even the gestures he would use. They would learn the wave of the hand, or they would learn the nod, because he's the master. It was a life of dedication for social and academic learning. There was you had to learn the life. And so when a student had reached a point of mastering the traditional material, he could quiz and follow his academics, and he could field and interact questions. He would be examined. He would be considered a Talmid Hakam, one who is non-ordained. But they have reached now a status of a Talmid Hakam, not fully ordained, but able to pass the test. But it wasn't until age 40 that it was decreed by the scribes, the masters, that now I can now give official rulings and opinions. I've mastered, I've passed my exams, my boards, so to speak, and officially make a judgment. Now, keep that in the back of your mind. We know Jesus wasn't age 40, right? So how do you think that went over when the young one starts telling them how things are? How things are. At that time, they could make rulings, legislation, pass judgments on civil cases, establish binding rituals. And at the time of Christ, from a social point, now again, this is things that I think are important to understand. These people that can denounce, and there's this huge contrast. From a social point, from the point of the people, the scribes were the immediate successors of the prophets. The prophets wrote and spoke to us. Scribes. They spoke for God. When a scribe spoke, it was God. That's the reverence that they had. It was their knowledge, their understanding of truth that they spoke for God. From the vantage of the people, the scribes possessed a divine, esoteric, mysterious insight into Scriptures. In fact, I appreciate sometimes when people say, well, boy, I wouldn't have got that out of the Scripture. I didn't know that. But there's also a side to that. It always scares me a little. I hope you were supposed to get it out of it, not me, okay? You see what I mean? So I only want to speak what's there. I'm not looking for any mysteries, okay? But the scribes had a sense of, I didn't know that. Well, we know that they were many times going. From people's point of view, they spoke for God. They had insights and mysteries that they couldn't have. The traditions, they showed people how they should live. So when a scribe spoke, you're like, well, they know what they're talking about. I'm just a common person. I'm just a common person. Josephus, a Jewish historian at the time of Christ, wrote regarding the Jewish people at the time that they give credit for wisdom only to those who have an exact knowledge of the law and are capable of interpreting the meaning of the Scriptures. And the scribes are those individuals. They're the wise people. They know. I don't know. They were authorized and established in their office and role by their knowledge, not because they were born that, but because they had worked to give them the insight into the divine ability to speak for God. Apart from the chief priests and the priestly families, only scribes could be members of the Sanhedrin. You might be scribes of the tradition of the Sadducees or scribes of the tradition of the Pharisees, but the 70 rulers, 70, had to be a scribe. The scribes held the intellectual and social sway on the nation. To the people, they were the esteemed. Now bear with me, I want to share a couple other things. But when Jesus is getting ready to denounce these people, it's like one step away from God. You're cutting down the very voice of God. Let me share a few more things. A scribe could be identified by a robe that he wore. It was a long, flowing white robe that reached clear to his feet. As it touched his feet, there were tassels and fringes that would extend on into the dirt below that. But the scribes' robes were always white. Other leaders, political leaders, others would wear other colors, but only a scribe could wear a white robe. You see, you get the kind of association connection. It's like he's almost an angel, in white robes. Like he's almost an angel, in white robes. So other royalty, others would wear different colors, but a scribe wore a white robe. And when they would walk amongst people, or a carpenter, except for tradesmen who were in the middle of their job, when a scribe came by, you were expected to stand up and greet them. So if you were in the market and you were just a merchant just selling fruit and vegetables, when he came by, you stood up. They were expected to rise and impart a greeting, calling him master, rabbi, father. When someone gave a feast, greatest honor would be to have a scribe and his pupils show up. You wanted to throw a party, a banquet, a wedding. The greatest honor is that you got a scribe to come and his pupils, his entourage behind him. It's like that was truly success. In fact, when they showed up at a banquet or a wedding, they were given the best place to sit, the highest place of honor, even above the elderly and people's parents. So think with this meal. See, we need to appreciate this. So you're having a wedding, okay? So think with this meal. See, we need to appreciate this. So you're having a wedding, okay? And oftentimes, you have your wedding party there, and then here's the groom's parents, and here's the bride's parents. And usually they're somewhere up front, right? And then you got grandma or grandpa or great grandma and grandpa. But when a scribe came in, it's like, I'm sorry, grandma. I'm sorry, you got to go sit over here. I'm sorry, mom and dad. The scribe has come. And so they got to sit right up front. Because there was no greater honor, no greater place. And so they ranked even above parents, above this group. All that I've taken the time to explain to help us appreciate that Jesus directs his confrontation. Look with me at verse 38. And he was saying, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses and for appearance sake offer long prayers. These will receive their greater condemnation. Do you think people swallowed hard at that? He didn't say they'll receive, their reward and it's not going to be as much. Jesus hit them square between the eyes. He criticizes the examples of their pride and ostentation expression that lacked 1 ounce of authenticity. We don't have the time this morning, but if you follow this back up in this passage, you remember the interchange between one scribe And what is the greatest commandment? The scribe asked him. What is the greatest commandment? The scribe asked him. And Jesus said to love the Lord your God with all that you are and love your neighbors yourself. And the scribe said, you're right. Jesus said, you're not far off. Because that scribe was saying no to all this stuff that he'd been taught. And he was on the right track of the issue of a heart. He didn't yet fully appreciate who Jesus was. But he was on the right track of not this exterior, ostentatious expression of their own arrogance and self-righteousness. Jesus was telling them it's not about social status and position. And so he goes through a series of things that were so important to them. Long robes, showing off their status, their haughtiness, their long robes, showing off their status, their haughtiness, their pride, their arrogance. You could see a scribe coming from a mile off because nobody's allowed to dress like him. You could look down the streets and all the market was and you could see the water parting of the people rising for the parade of the scribe. He says, you love that. You love that haughtiness. Long robes. He says you love greetings in the marketplace. As I was thinking about this, we all have days when we're down, we're blue, discouraged. We all have them, right? Days. You know what? If I was a scribe and you wanted to boost your ego a little bit, just go for a walk in the marketplace, right? It's I'm kind of not feeling very good today. Let me just go for a walk in the market. Okay? We all can picture an ancient marketplace, right? Just steaming with people there, and greet him. In fact, I thought, in fact, at the time of Christ, in the first century, probably a few years after Christ, maybe around 50 or so AD. But there is a writing in the Talmud about the great Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai. And they note in here that he was the first scribe recorded to greet others in the marketplace. Now think about that. Because see, everybody would say, Rabbi, teacher, father. But they, Rabbi, teacher, father. But they wouldn't greet anybody else. And it was so radical that he would actually say good morning or hi. He would greet back. Before him, they just walked through, didn't say a word. There's nobody's presence. Because there's nobody bigger than them. Maybe think of Carly Simon's song from years ago, You're So Vain. You're so vain. You probably think this song's about you. And Jesus acknowledges, which I've already mentioned, their chief seats in the synagogue. That was probably referring to when the Torah scrolls were stored in a box up at the front of the synagogue, and right beside that was a bench. And so and that bench faced the congregation, and they liked to sit up there so that everybody could see them. They could see everybody else looking at them. And the seats at banquets and celebration, as I've already mentioned, they wherever they went, they got VIP. Interesting phrase. He says they devour widows' houses. Scholars are kind of, what did they do? But the point is that they were unprincipled and unethical when it comes to widows. Now, we're going to see in a moment, there is a widow that's going to be contrasted, Jesus and by Mark. Perhaps, since they were the legal scholars, as they needed some legal work done, same as you would for an attorney today, some scholars believe that they charged exorbitant rates for legal work and advice. And you do it for a widow and you end up making her destitute. They didn't care. As long as I got my money, right? There's another several scholars believe that the vowels that the scribes always ate out, okay? Because wherever you go, right? Oh yeah, I'll feed you something to eat. And so they just would go to people's house. Hey, let's go to widow so-and-so's house. She was a great cook. I remember that. She used to be. And so they would go there and get free meals. They're always bumming off of everyone else. We know that the widow will fix us a meal. So they were freeloaders. So whether it was through fees of charging for legal work, whether it was because they would go and eat at their houses, but you're draining some of the most vulnerable people of our society. And then he says at the end, they're long prayers just to show off. So I know I've spent time thinking this, but I think it's important that he was striking at the very pinnacle of society, the most respected individuals, and he's pulling the cloak off, if you will, and he said it's all a fraud, a sham. They had made following God all about externals. That's what the point is. In another incident that Jesus called them, He says, you're like whitewashed. You're white on the outside, but you're full of dead man's bones. They had made everything about these externals. And we're going to get there in just a moment. Jesus is going to contrast. That's not what it's about. It's about an issue of your heart. You see, I think across history, if we really don't struggle and fight with it, we miss the issues of the heart. Our natural, human, fleshly bent is to go to the externals. If we can look good, if we can do the right things, dot the I's, cross the T's. But Jesus said it's not about that. It's about the heart. You know, in the last several years, particularly in younger circles, there's been a buzzword about being authentic. You know, you're authentic. You know, if you worship a certain way, you raise your hands. Oh, they're just authentic. If you dress a certain way, they're just being authentic. But a pastor friend of mine, Gary Pauley in Kansas City, went to school with him and he pastors there. And he wrote a little blog about this. Gary's got a sharp mind, that he was provoked by some things. And I just wanted to read this. Being in promotion has to do with what kind of clothes people wear to church on Sunday. He says, okay, I get it. People have to dress up to go to work and they don't want to again on Sunday or whatever. But there's a lot of talk around this issue that needs to be analyzed. What I've heard, Gary writes, what I've heard a couple times lately is the charge that because we don't dress up at our church, we are more authentic. Really? Is that what authenticity is? Gary writes, several thoughts came to my mind as I heard this claim a couple of times. Seems I've met plenty of people in casual attire who are less than authentic. Even large groups of them. Example, high school. Was it more real for a community because jeans were the norm? This sounds like a different version of the original problem. The complaint is that people don't want their spirituality to be judged by how they dress. But why is that different to be deemed off some kind of cotton blend? The claim is dreadfully superficial, Gary writes. Many of the same people who are screaming for authenticity in dress will spend $70 for a pair of jeans that bear evidence of experiences they never had. Rips and stains are preloaded on jeans to make it look like the wearer has been somewhere doing something they never did. Is that authentic? Genuine? Real? Look, I don't care what pants you wear on Sunday, really. More than that, I don't want to talk about it. And I certainly am not going to make it the focus when I talk about whether or not you should come to my church. And for goodness sake, I'm not going to attach some kind of moral value to the kind of clothes you wear or we wear at church. Now, if our culture should end up being a culture of people who wear knickers, tube socks, then I would guess that we end up wearing that to church too. Evidence, no one wears robes and sandals to church anymore. We do reflect our culture. That's hardly a grand concession. We all know it. We just don't always admit it. By suggesting that we are more awful, we are promoting a false value system. We give the impression that by being part of a more authentic community, we are inherently more real. Gary writes, the danger with this is self-righteousness. Gary says, I have a different idea. Wear what you want on Sunday. Modesty is still an issue and needs to be kept in mind, but let's don't talk about it. We won't promote our church on the basis of our stylistic preferences in clothing. We won't judge each other on which pants we choose, casual or formal. We'll pursue an authenticity based on biblical norms and personal integrity. You see, that's what it's about. And so, in some ways, perhaps maybe we've swung the other way. Oh, this is more authentic. This is more real. And the whole point is we miss the issue of the heart. If you wear a tie and a three-piece suit, or you're no more spiritual or real or honest or genuine if you have jeans that have rips in them. You see, we may be missing the same issue that the scribes missed. It's the issue of your heart. It's the issue of your heart. It's in that context, what we've spent a lot of time this morning. It's in that context of people that didn't get it, that Jesus brings on the scene. Jesus brings on the scene a little old lady who got it. Now, we don't know if she was little and if she was old. That's the way I imagine her, okay? But we do know that she was a widow. And so on opposite the treasury, and he began observing how the people were putting money into the treasury, and many rich people were putting in large sums. And a poor widow came in and put in 2 small copper coins, which amount to a cent. And calling it, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the contributors to the treasury. For they all put in out of their surplus, but she out of her poverty put in all she owned and all she had to live on. Again, before we get to capsulizing this point, again, to appreciate a little bit more the context. Around the temple court, there were 13 repositories where you could deposit money. And they had trumpet-shaped or bell money. And they had trumpet-shaped or bell-shaped receptacles. And that's where you put your money into. And as you can imagine from all that we've learned, okay, that this too was a big event. To come and to give bell. Giving became quite a show, quite a spectacle. I thought of, have any of you been over the years to maybe like, I know the Children's Museum in Indianapolis has it. The Science Center up in Fort Wayne has it. Sometimes kids wear the coin in it, and it goes around and around and around and around. Till finally it drops in down at the bottom. I think somewhat that's what this was with these bells. In fact, one scholar says that they would learn to toss them in there and fling them around. Clang the brass bell. You've probably been at the bank before when somebody brings in to the change counter. Have any of you been in there when they bring in some change to be counted? And they go and they put it in and it goes, it starts rattling, going through, counting the change, Oh, yeah, everybody's, counting the change. That's what they're giving, Oh, yeah, everybody's, counting the change. That's what they're giving to become like. Matthew 6:2, Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount talks about don't sound a trumpet. Now, it's possible that they could have been literal. You sound the trumpet. You money today. Some scholars believe that it referred to sounding the trumpet by throwing it in there and rattling it. Okay, so whether it was that rattling, but they were doing it. They were doing it. Everybody needed to know that they were giving. Some even speculate based on some things that maybe they announced the amount. Some even speculate based on some things that maybe they announced the amount. Today, Rabbi so-and-so is giving you $1,000. It's in that contrast that Jesus sits back and observes, and Christ calls His disciples and He points her out. He says, that widow gave more than everyone else. I mean, like Jesus, 2 pennies do not equal $1,000. How does this add up? And so Christ exalted the greatness of her gift, not because of the amount, but because of her spirit and her sacrifice. Christ clarified that it's not the size of the gift, but the generosity of the giver. You see, that's what heaven measures our giving. That's what heaven measures our giving by. It's not by the size of the gift, it's by the generosity of the giver. You see, heaven doesn't measure by the amount of the check. It measures by the largeness of it. This is not about externals. So on a general accounting, you don't have to be a CPA, to figure out, well, that's more dollars. Okay, even a preschooler can figure out, well, that's more than this. But that's not the way heaven measures. You see, heaven looks at the heart. Heaven looks at the heart. Jesus says in her 2 coins, all that she owned, all that she had to live on, she gave it all. I have meditated on this many times. I don't think any one of us would have faulted the lady for saying, I only have 2 coins left. And I'm going to give one, and the other one I'm going to take and go get a piece of bread because I don't have anything. I don't think any of us would have said, well, so you think you got to have a piece of bread. I mean, we wouldn't have faulted her. We wouldn't have thought 2 coins, that's all she had. But there's an important truth to this that fits in the whole context and finally brings it to a point. It's the issue of this. It's not about externals. God is looking at our heart, and our devotion is not measured by what we give, but by what we withhold. Is not measured by what we give, but by what we withhold. Our devotion is not measured by what we give, it's by what we withhold. After all, if you really think about it, that is a tough one to sing. I've known some people say, I'm not going to sing it Because, well, make it your desire. Sometimes we want to withhold our children. Oh God, no, you can't send them there. We want to withhold our comforts. Well, God, I don't feel comfortable. I don't like that. God, I don't want to express myself. I don't want to. See, God doesn't measure by what we give. He measures by what we withhold. That's why in Genesis chapter 22, verse 12, withhold. That's why in Genesis chapter 22, verse 12, you know the story, Abraham and his son Isaac. When the words from heaven came, he said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son." That was the issue, is he didn't hold anything back. You see, heaven looks not and doesn't measure our devotion by what we give. It measures by what we hold back. It's an issue of our heart. So, if you meditate on the whole context where this is all flowed out of, loving God with all your heart, all your strength. You see, God wants all of us. All of us. He wants us to love with all that we are. And so, Jesus and Mark, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, introduces us to a little nameless character who didn't hold anything back. I pray that as we seek to follow God, may the focus not be externals. May the focus not be on what we give. May it be an issue of our heart and what we